Chapter 14 of The Mind and Its Education by George Herbert BETTS. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Rimaderchi. Feeling and its functions. In the psychical world as well as the physical, we must meet and overcome inertia. Our lives must be compelled by motive forces strong enough to overcome this natural inertia, and enable us, besides, to make headway against many obstacles. The motive power that drives us consists chiefly of our feelings and emotions. Knowledge, cognition, supplies the rudder that guides our ship, but feeling and emotion supply the power. To convince one's head is therefore not enough. His feelings must be stirred if you would be sure of moving him to action. Often we have known that a certain line of action was right, but failed to follow it because feeling led in a different direction. When decision has been hanging in the balance, we have piled on one side obligation, duty, sense of right, and a dozen other reasons for action, only to have them all outweighed by one single, it is disagreeable. Judgment, reason, and experience may unite to tell us that a contemplated course is unwise, and imagination may reveal to us its disastrous consequences, and yet its pleasures so appeal to us that we yield. Our feelings often prove a stronger motive than the knowledge and will combined. They are a factor constantly to be reckoned with among our motives. 1. The nature of feeling. It will be our purpose in the next few chapters to study the affective content of consciousness, the feelings and emotions. The present chapter will be devoted to the feelings and the one that follows to the emotions. The different feeling qualities. At least 6, some writers say even more, distinct and qualitatively different feeling states are easily distinguished. These are pleasure, pain, desire, repugnance, interest, apathy. Pleasure and pain and desire and repugnance are directly opposite or anti-agnostic feelings. Interest and apathy are not opposites in a similar way, since apathy is but the absence of interest and not its antagonist. In place of the terms pleasure and pain, the pleasant and the unpleasant, or the agreeable and the disagreeable are often used. Aversion is frequently employed as a synonym for repugnance. It is somewhat hard to believe on first thought that feeling comprises but these classes given. For have we not often felt the pain from a toothache, from not being able to take a long-planned trip, from the loss of a dear friend? Surely these are very different classes of feelings. Likewise, we have been happy from the very joy of living, from being praised for some well-doing, or from the presence of a friend or lover, and here again we seem to have widely different classes of feelings. We must remember, however, that feeling is always based on something known. It never appears alone in consciousness as mere pleasures or pains. The mind must have something about which to feel. The what must precede the how. What we commonly call a feeling is a complex state of consciousness in which feeling predominates, but which has nevertheless a basis of sensation or memory or some other cognitive process. And what so greatly varies in the different cases of the illustrations just given is precisely this knowledge element, and not the feeling element. A feeling of unpleasantness is a feeling of unpleasantness, whether it comes from an aching tooth or from the loss of a friend. It may differ in degree, and the entire mental states of which the feeling is a part may differ vastly, but the simple feeling itself is of the same quality. Feeling always present in mental content. No phase of our mental life is without the feeling element. We look at the rainbow with its beautiful and harmonious blending of colors, and a feeling of pleasure accompanies the sensation. Then we turn and gaze at the glaring sun, and a disagreeable feeling is the result. A strong feeling of pleasantness accompanies the experience of the voluptuous warmth of a cozy bed on a cold morning. But the plunge between the icy sheets on the preceding evening was accompanied by the opposite feeling. The touch of a hand may occasion a thrill of ecstatic pleasure, or it may be accompanied by a feeling equally disagreeable, and so on through the whole range of sensation. We not only know the various objects about us through sensation and perception, but we also feel while we know. Cognition, or the knowing process, gives us our whats, and feeling, or the affective process, gives us our hows. What is yonder object? A bouquet. How does it affect you? Pleasurably. If instead of the simpler sensory processes which we have just considered, we take the more complex processes, such as memory, imagination, and thinking, the case is no different. Who has not reveled in the pleasures accompanying the memories of past joys? On the other hand, who is free from all unpleasant memories, from regrets, from pangs of remorse? Who has not dreamed away an hour in pleasant anticipation of some desired object, or spent a miserable hour in dreading some calamity which imagination pictured to him? Feeling also accompanies our thought processes. Everyone has experienced the feeling of pleasure, of intellectual victory over some difficult problem which had baffled the reason, or over some doubtful case in which our judgment proved correct. And likewise, none has escaped the feeling of unpleasantness which accompanies intellectual defeat. Whatever the contents of our mental stream, we find in them everywhere present a certain color of passing estimate, an immediate sense that they are worth something to us at any given moment, or that they have an interest to us. The seeming neutral feeling zone. It is probable that there is so little feeling connected with many of the humdrum and habitual experiences of our everyday lives, that we are but slightly, if at all, aware of a feeling state in connection with them. Yet, a state of consciousness with absolutely no feeling side to it is as unthinkable as the obverse side of a coin without the reverse. Some sort of feeling tone or mood is always present. The width of the affective neutral zone, that is, of a feeling state so little marked as not to be discriminated as either pleasure or pain, desire or aversion, varies with different persons, and with the same person at different times. It is conditioned largely by the amount of attention given in the direction of feeling, and also on the finesse of the power of feeling discrimination. It is safe to say that the zero range is usually so small as to be negligible. 2. Mood and disposition. The sum total of all the feeling accompanying the various sensory and thought processes at any given time results in what we may call our feeling tone or mood. How mood is produced. During most of our waking hours, and indeed during our sleeping hours as well, a multitude of sensory currents are pouring into our cortical centers. At the present moment we can hear the rumble of a wagon, the chirp of a cricket, the chatter of distant voices, and 100 other sounds besides. At the same time, the eye is appealed to by an infinite variety of stimuli in light, color, and objects. The skin responds to many contacts and temperatures, and every other type of end organ of the body is acting as a sender to telegraph a message into the brain. Add to these the powerful currents which are constantly being sent to the cortex from the visceral organs, those of respiration, of circulation, of digestion, and assimilation. And then finally add the central processes which accompany the flight of images through our minds, our meditations, memories, and imaginations, our cogitations and volitions. Thus we see what a complex our feelings must be, and how impossible to have any moment in which some feeling is not present as a part of our mental stream. It is this complex, now made up chiefly on the basis of the sensory currents coming in from the end organs or the visceral organs, and now on the basis of those in the cortex connected with our thought life, which constitutes the entire feeling tone or mood. Mood colors all our thinking. Mood depends on the character of the aggregate of nerve currents entering the cortex, and changes as the character of the current varies. If the currents run on much the same from hour to hour, then our mood is correspondingly constant. If the currents are variable, our mood also will be variable. Not only is mood dependent on our sensations and thoughts for its quality, but, in turn, colors our entire mental life. It serves as a background or setting, whose hue is reflected over all our thinking. Let the mood be somber and dark, and all the world looks gloomy. On the other hand, let the mood be bright and cheerful, and the world puts on a smile. It is told of one of the early circuit riders among the New England ministry that he made the following entries in his diary, thus well illustrating the point. Wednesday evening. Arrived at the home of Bro Brown. Late this evening. Hungry and tired after a long day in the saddle. Had a bountiful supper of cold pork and beans, warm bread, bacon, and eggs, coffee, and rich pastry. I go to rest feeling that my witness is clear, the future is bright, I feel called to a great and glorious work in this place. Bro Brown's family are good people. The next entry was as follows. Thursday morning. Awakened late this morning after a troubled night. I am very much depressed in soul. The way looks dark. Far from feeling called to work among this people, I am beginning to doubt the safety of my own soul. I am afraid the desires of Bro Brown and his family are set too much on carnal things. A dyspeptic is usually a pessimist. and an optimist always keeps a bright mood. Mood influences our judgment and decisions. The prattle of children may be grateful music to our ears when we are in one mood, and excruciatingly discordant noise when we are in another. What appeals to us as a good practical joke one day may seem a piece of unwarranted impertinence on another. A proposition which looks entirely plausible under the sanguine mood induced by a persuasive orator may appear wholly untenable a few hours later. Decisions which seemed warranted when we were in an angry mood often appear unwise or unjust when we have become more calm. Motives which easily impel us to action when the world looks bright fail to move us when the mood is somber. The feeling of impending peril and calamity, which are an inevitable accompaniment of the blues, are speedily dissipated when the sun breaks through the clouds and we are ourselves again. Mood influences effort. A bright and hopeful mood quickens every power and enhances every effort, while a hopeless mood limits power and cripples effort. The football team which goes into the game discouraged never plays to the limit. The student who attacks his lesson under the conviction of defeat can hardly hope to succeed, while the one who enters upon his work confident of his power to master it has the battle already half won. The world's best work is done not by those who live in the shadow of discouragement and doubt, but by those in whose breast hope springs eternal. The optimist is a benefactor of the race, if for no other reason than the sheer contagion of his hopeful spirit. The pessimist contributes neither to the world's welfare nor its happiness. Youth's proverbial enthusiasm and dauntless energy rests upon the supreme hopefulness which characterizes the mood of the young. For these reasons, if for no other, the mood of the schoolroom should be one of happiness and good cheer. Disposition, a resultant of moods. The sum total of our moods gives us our disposition. Whether these are pleasant or unpleasant, cheerful or gloomy, will depend on the predominating character of the moods which enter into them. As well expect to gather grapes of thorns or figs or thistles as to secure a desirable disposition out of undesirable moods. A sunny disposition never comes from gloomy moods, nor a hopeful one out of the blues. And it is our disposition more than the power of our reason, which after all determines our desirability as friends and companions. The person of surly disposition can hardly make a desirable companion, no matter what his intellectual qualities may be. We may live very happily with one who cannot follow the reasoning of a Newton, but it is hard to live with a person chronically subject to black moods. Nor can we put the responsibility for our disposition off on our ancestors. It is not an inheritance, but a growth. Slowly, day by day, and mood by mood, we build up our disposition until finally it comes to characterize us. Temperament. Some are, however, more predisposed to certain types of mood than are others. The organization of our nervous system, which we get through heredity, undoubtedly has much to do with the feeling tone in which we most easily fall. We call this predisposition temperament. On the effects of temperament, our ancestors must divide the responsibility with us. I say divide the responsibility. For even if we find ourselves predisposed towards a certain undesirable type of moods, there is no reason why we should give up to them. Even in spite of hereditary predispositions, we can still largely determine for ourselves what our moods are to be. If we have a tendency toward cheerful, quiet, and optimistic moods, the psychologist names our temperament sanguine. If we are tense, easily excited, and irritable with a tendency towards sullen or angry moods, the choleric. If we are given to frequent fits of the blues, if we usually look on the dark side of things and have a tendency toward moods of discouragement and the dumps, the melancholic, if hard to rouse and given to indolent and indifferent moods, the phlegmatic. Whatever be our temperament, it is one of the most important factors in our character. 3. Permanent feeling, attitudes, or sentiments. Besides the more or less transitory feeling states which we have called moods, there exists also a class of feeling attitudes, which contain more of the complex intellectual element, are withal of rather a higher nature, and much more permanent than our moods. We may call these our sentiments or attitudes. Our sentiments comprise the somewhat constant level of feeling combined with cognition, which we name sympathy, friendship, love, patriotism, religious faith, selfishness, pride, vanity, etc. Like our dispositions, our sentiments are a growth of months and years. Unlike our dispositions, however, our sentiments are relatively independent of the physiological undertone and depend more largely upon long-continued experience and intellectual elements as a basis. A sluggish liver might throw us into an irritable mood, and, if the condition were long continued, might result in a surly disposition. But it would hardly permanently destroy one's patriotism and make him turn traitor to his country. One's feeling attitude on such matters is too deep-seated to be modified by changing whims. How sentiments develop. Sentiments have their beginning in concrete experiences in which feeling is a predominant element, and grow through the multiplication of these experiences, much as the concept is developed through many percepts. There is a residual element left behind each separate experience in both cases. In the case of the concept, the residual element is intellectual, and in the case of the sentiment, it is a complex in which the feeling element is predominant. How this comes about is easily seen by means of an illustration or two. The mother feeds her child when he is hungry, and an agreeable feeling is produced. She puts him into the bath and snuggles him in her arms, and the experiences are pleasant. The child comes to look upon the mother as one whose especial function is to make things pleasant for him. So he comes to be happy in her presence, and long for her in her absence. He finally grows to love his mother, not alone for the countless times she has given him pleasure, but for what she herself is. The feelings connected at first wholly with pleasant experiences coming through the ministrations of the mother, strengthened, no doubt, by instinctive tendencies toward affection, and later enhanced by a fuller realization of what a mother's care and sacrifice mean, grow at last into a deep, forceful, abiding sentiment of love for the mother. The effect of experience. Likewise, with the sentiment of patriotism, insofar as our patriotism is a true patriotism and not a noisy clamor, it had its rise in feelings of gratitude and love when we contemplated the deeds of heroism and sacrifice for the flag, and the blessings which come to us from our relations as citizens to our country. If we have had concrete cases brought to our experience, as, for example, our property saved from destruction at the hands of a mob, or our lives saved from a hostile foreign foe, the patriotic sentiment will be all the stronger. So we may carry the illustration into all the sentiments. Our religious sentiments of adoration, love, and faith have their origin in our belief in the care, love, and support from a higher being, typified to us as children by the care, love, and support of our parents. Pride arises from the appreciation or over-appreciation of oneself, his attainments or his belongings. Selfishness has its genesis in the many instances in which pleasure results from ministering to self. In all these cases, it is seen that our sentiments develop out of our experiences. They are the permanent but ever-growing results which we have to show for experiences which are somewhat long-continued, and in which a certain feeling quality is a strong accompaniment of the cognitive part of the experience. The influence of sentiment. Our sentiments, like our dispositions, are not only a natural growth from the experiences upon which they are fed, but they in turn have large influence in determining the direction of our further development. Our sentiments furnish the soil which is either favorable or hostile to the growth of new experiences. One in whom the sentiment of true patriotism is deep-rooted will find it much harder to respond to a suggestion to betray his country's honor on a battlefield, in legislative hall, or in private life, than one lacking in this sentiment. The boy who has a strong sentiment of love for his mother will find this a restraining influence in the face of temptation to commit deeds which would wound her feelings. A deep and abiding faith in God is fatal to the growth of pessimism, distrust, and a self-centered life. One's sentiments are a safe gauge of his character. Let us know a man's attitude or sentiments on religion, morality, friendship, honesty, and the other great questions of life, and little remains to be known. If he is right on these, he may well be trusted in other things. If he is wrong on these, then there is little to build upon. Literature has drawn its best inspiration and choicest themes from the field of our sentiments. The sentiment of friendship has given us our David and Jonathan, our Damon and Pythias, and our Tennyson and Hallam. The sentiment of love has inspired countless masterpieces. Without its aid, most of our fiction would lose its plot, and most of our poetry its charm. Religious sentiment inspired Milton to write the world's greatest epic, Paradise Lost. The sentiment of patriotism has furnished an inexhaustible theme for the writer and the orator. Likewise, if we go into the field of music and art, we find that the best efforts of the masters are clustered around some human sentiment which has appealed to them, and which they have immortalized by expressing it on canvas or on marble, that it may appeal to others and cause the sentiment to grow in us. Sentiments as motives. The sentiments furnish the deepest, most constant, and the most powerful motives which control our lives. Such sentiments as patriotism, liberty, and religion have called 1,000 armies to struggle and die on 10,000 battlefields, and have given martyrs courage to suffer in the fires of persecution. Sentiments of friendship and love have prompted countless deeds of self-sacrifice and loving devotion. Sentiments of envy, pride, and jealousy have changed the boundary lines of nations and have prompted the committing of 10,000 unnameable crimes. Slowly, day by day, from the cradle to the grave, we are weaving into our lives the threads of sentiment, which has at last become so many cables to bind us to good or evil. 4. Problems in observation and introspection. 1. Are you subject to the blues or other forms of depressed feeling? Are your moods very changeable or rather constant? What kind of a disposition do you think you have? How did you come by it? That is, in how far is it due to hereditary temperament, and in how far to your daily moods? 2. Can you recall an instance in which some undesirable mood was caused by your physical condition, by some disturbing mental condition? What is your characteristic mood in the morning after sleeping in an ill-ventilated room, after sitting for half a day in an ill-ventilated schoolroom, after eating indigestible food before going to bed? 3. Observe a number of children or your classmates closely and see whether you can determine the characteristic mood of each. Observe several different schools and see whether you can note a characteristic mood for each room. Try to determine the causes producing the differences noted: physical conditions in the room, personality of the teacher, methods of governing, teaching, etc. 4. When can you do your best work? When you are happy or unhappy, cheerful or blue, confident and hopeful or discouraged, in a spirit of harmony and cooperation with your teacher or anti-agnostic. Now, relate your conclusions to the type of atmosphere that should prevail in the schoolroom or the home. Formulate a statement as to why the spirit of the school is all important. Effect on effort, growth, disposition, sentiments, character, etc. 5. Can you measure more or less accurately the extent to which your feelings serve as motives in your life? Are your feelings alone a safe guide to action? Make a list of the important sentiments that should be cultivated in youth. Now, show how the work of the school may be used to strengthen worthy sentiments. End of Chapter 14. Recording by Karima Readout.
Chapter 15 of The Mind and Its Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mind and Its Education by George Herbert BETTS. Chapter 15. The Emotions. Feeling and emotion are not to be looked upon as two different kinds of mental processes. In fact, emotion is but a feeling state of a high degree of intensity and complexity. Emotion transcends the simpler feeling states, whenever the exciting cause is sufficient to throw us out of our regular routine of affective experience. The distinction between emotion and feeling is a purely arbitrary one, since the difference is only one of complexity and degree, and many feelings may rise to the intensity of emotions. A feeling of sadness on hearing the number of fatalities in a railway accident may suddenly become an emotion of grief if we learn that a member of our family is among those killed. A feeling of gladness may develop into an emotion of joy, or a feeling of resentment be kindled into an emotion of rage. 1. The producing and expressing of emotion. Nowhere more than in connection with our emotions are the close interrelations of mind and body seen. All are familiar with the fact that the emotion of anger tends to find expression in the blow, love in the caress, fear in flight, and so on. But just how our organism acts in producing an emotion is less generally understood. Professor James and Professor Lang have shown us that emotion not only tends to produce some characteristic form of response, but that the emotion is itself caused by certain deep-seated physiological reactions. Let us seek to understand this statement a little more fully. Physiological explanation of emotion. We must remember first of all that all changes in mental states are accompanied by corresponding physiological changes. Hard, concentrated thinking quickens the heartbeat. Keen attention is accompanied by muscular tension. Certain sights or sounds increase the rate of breathing. Offensive odors produce nausea, and so on. So complete and perfect is the response of our physical organism to mental changes that one psychologist declares it possible, had we sufficiently delicate apparatus, to measure the reactions caused throughout the body of a sleeping child by the shadow from a passing cloud falling upon the closed eyelids. The order of the entire event resulting in an emotion is as follows. 1. Something is known. Some object enters consciousness coming either from immediate perception or through memory or imagination. This fact or thing known must be of such nature that it will, 2. set up deep-seated and characteristic organic response. 3. The feeling accompanying and caused by these physiological reactions constitutes the emotion. For example, we may be passing along the street in a perfectly calm and equable state of mind, when we come upon a teamster who is brutally beating an exhausted horse because it is unable to draw an overloaded wagon up a slippery incline. The facts grasped as we take in this situation constitute the first element in an emotional response developing in our consciousness. But instantly our muscles begin to grow tense, the heart beat and breath quicken, the face takes on a different expression, the hands clench, the entire organism is reacting to the disturbing situation. The second factor in the rising emotion, the physiological response, thus appears. Along with our apprehension of the cruelty and the organic disturbances which result, we feel waves of indignation and anger surging through us. This is the third factor in the emotional event, or the emotion itself. In some such way as this are all of our emotions aroused. Origin of characteristic emotional reactions. Why do certain facts or objects of consciousness always cause certain characteristic organic responses? In order to solve this problem, we shall have first to go beyond the individual and appeal to the history of the race. What the race has found serviceable, the individual repeats. But even then, it is hard to see why the particular type of physical response, such as shrinking, pallor, and trembling, which naturally follows stimuli threatening harm, should be the best. It is easy to see, however, that the feeling which prompts to flight or serves to deter from harm's way might be useful. It is plain that there is an advantage in the tense muscle, the set teeth, the held breath, and the quickened pulse which accompany the emotion of anger, and also in the feeling of anger itself, which prompts to the conflict. But even if we are not able in every case to determine at this day why all the instinctive responses and their correlate of feeling were the best for the life of the race, we may be sure that such was the case. For nature is inexorable in her dictates that only that shall persist which has proved serviceable in the largest number of cases. An interesting question arises at this point as to why we feel emotion accompanying some of our motor responses, and not others. Perceptions are crowding in upon us hour after hour. Memory, thought, and imagination are in constant play, and a continuous motor discharge results each moment in physical expressions, great or small. Yet, in spite of these facts, feeling, which is strong enough to rise to an emotion, is only an occasional thing. If emotion accompanies any form of physical expression, why not all? Let us see whether we can discover any reason. One day I saw a boy leading a dog along the street. All at once the dog slipped the string over its head and ran away. The boy stood looking after the dog for a moment, and then burst into a fit of rage. What all had happened? The moment before the dog broke away, everything was running smoothly in the experience of the boy. There was no obstruction to his thought or his plans. Then in an instant the situation changes. The smooth flow of experience is checked and baffled. The discharge of nerve currents, which meant thought, plans, action, is blocked. A crisis has arisen which requires readjustment. The nerve currents must flow in new directions, giving new thought, new plans, new activities. The dog must be recaptured. It is in connection with this damming up of nerve currents from following their wonted channels that the emotion emerges. Or, putting it into mental terms, the emotion occurs when the ordinary current of our thought is violently disturbed, where we meet with some crisis, which necessitates a readjustment of our thought relations and plans, either temporarily or permanently. The duration of an emotion. If the required readjustment is but temporary, then the emotion is short-lived, while if the readjustment is necessarily of longer duration, the emotion also will live longer. The fear which follows the thunder is relatively brief, for the shock is gone in a moment, and our thought is but temporarily disturbed. If the impending danger is one that persists, however, as of some secret assassin threatening our life, the fear also will persist. The grief of a child over the loss of someone dear to him is comparatively short because the current of the child's life has not been so closely bound up in a complexity of experiences with the lost object as in the case of an older person, and hence the readjustment is easier. The grief of an adult over the loss of a very dear friend lasts long, for the object grieved over has so become a part of the bereaved one's experience that the loss requires a very complete readjustment of the whole life. In either case, however, as this readjustment is accomplished, the emotion gradually fades away. Emotions accompanying crises in experience. If our description of the feelings has been correct, it will be seen that the simpler and milder feelings are for the common run of our everyday experience. They are the common valuers of our thought and acts from hour to hour. The emotions, or more intense feeling states, are, however, the occasional high tide of feeling which occurs in crises or emergencies. We are angry on some particular provocation. We fear some extraordinary factor in our environment. We are joyful over some unusual good fortune. 2. The control of emotions. Dependence on expression. Since all emotions rest upon some form of physical or physiological expression primarily, and upon some thought back of this secondarily, it follows that the first step in controlling an emotion is to secure the removal of the state of consciousness which serves at its basis. This may be done, for instance, with a child, either by banishing the terrifying dog from his presence or by convincing him that the dog is harmless. The motor response will then cease and the emotion pass away. If the thought is persistent, however, through the continuance of its stimulus, then what remains is to seek to control the physical expression, and in that way suppress the emotion. If instead of the knit brow, the tense muscles, the quickened heartbeat, and all the deeper organic changes which go along with these, we can keep a smile on the face, the muscles relaxed, the heartbeat steady, and a normal condition in all the other organs, we shall have no cause to fear an explosion of anger. If we are afraid of mice and feel an almost irresistible tendency to mount a chair every time we see a mouse, we can do wonders in suppressing the fear by resolutely refusing to give an expression to these tendencies. Inhibition of the expression inevitably means the death of the emotion. This fact has its bad side, as well as its good in the feeling life, for it means that good emotions as well as bad will fade out if we fail to allow them expression. We are all perfectly familiar with the fact in our own experience that an interest which does not find means of expression soon passes away. Sympathy unexpressed ere long passes over into indifference. Even love cannot live without expression. Religious emotion which does not go out in deeds of service cannot persist. The natural end and aim of our emotions is to serve as motives to activity, and missing this opportunity, they have not only failed in their office, but will themselves die of inaction. Relief through expression. Emotional states not only have their rise in organic reactions, but they also tend to result in acts. When we are angry or in love or in fear, we have the impulse to do something about it. And while it is true that emotions may be inhibited by suppressing the physical expressions on which it is founded, so many a state of emotional tension be relieved by some forms of expression. None have failed to experience the relief which comes to the overcharged nervous system from a good cry. There is no sorrow so bitter as a dry sorrow when one cannot weep. A state of anger or annoyance is relieved by an explosion of some kind, whether in a blow or its equivalent in speech. We often feel better when we have told a man what we think of him. At first glance, this all seems opposed to what we have been laying down as the explanation of emotion. Yet it is not so if we look well into the case. We have already seen that emotion occurs when there is a blocking of the usual pathways of discharge for the nerve currents, which must then seek new outlets, and thus result in the setting up of new motor responses. In the case of grief, for example, there is a disturbance in the whole organism. The heartbeat is deranged, the blood pressure diminished, and the nerve tone lowered. What is needed is for the currents which are finding an outlet in directions resulting in these particular responses to find a pathway of discharge which will not produce such deep-seated results. This may be found in crying. The energy thus expended is diverted from producing internal disturbances. Likewise, the explosion in anger may serve to restore the equilibrium of disturbed nerve currents. Relief does not follow if image is held before the mind. All this is true, however, only when the expression does not serve to keep the idea before the mind which was originally responsible for the emotion. A person may work himself into a passion of anger by beginning to talk about an insult, and as he grows increasingly violent, bringing the situation more and more sharply into his consciousness. The effect of terrifying images is easily to be observed in the case of one's starting to run when he is afraid after night. There is probably no doubt that the running would relieve his fear providing he could do it and not picture the threatening something as pursuing him. But with his imagination conjuring up dire images of frightful catastrophes, at every step, all control is lost, and fresh waves of terror surge over the shrinking soul. Growing tendency toward emotional control. Among civilized peoples, there is a constantly growing tendency toward emotional control. Primitive races express grief, joy, fear, or anger much more freely than do civilized races. This does not mean that primitive man feels more deeply than civilized man. For, as we have already seen, the crying, laughing, or blustering is all but a small part of the whole physical expression, and one's entire organism may be stirred to its depths without any of these outward manifestations. Man has found it advisable, as he has advanced in civilization, not to reveal all he feels to those around him. The face, which is the most expressive part of the body, has come to be under such perfect control that it is hard to read through it the emotional state, although the face of civilized man is capable of expressing far more than is that of the savage. The same difference is observable between the child and the adult. The child reveals each passing shade of emotion through his expression, while the adult may feel much that he does not show. 3. Cultivation of the emotions. There is no other mental factor which has more to do with the enjoyment we get out of life than our feelings and emotions. The emotions and enjoyment. Few of us would care to live at all if all feeling were eliminated from human experience. True, feeling often makes us suffer. But in so far as life's joys triumph over its woes, do our feelings minister to our enjoyment. Without sympathy, love, and appreciation, life would be barren indeed. Moreover, it is only through our own emotional experience that we are able to interpret this feeling side of the lives about us. Failing in this, we miss one of the most significant phases of social experience, and are left with our own sympathies undeveloped and our life by so much impoverished. The interpretation of the subtler emotions of those about us is in no small degree an art. The human face and form present a constantly changing panorama of the soul's feeling states to those who can read their signs. The ability to read the finer feelings which reveal themselves in expression too delicate to be read by the eye of the gross or unsympathetic observer lies at the basis of all fine interpretation of personality. Feelings are often too deep for outward expression, and we are slow to reveal our deepest selves to those who cannot appreciate and understand them. How emotions develop. Emotions are to be cultivated, as the intellect or the muscles are to be cultivated, namely through proper exercise. Our thought is to dwell on those things to which proper emotions attach, and to shun lines which would suggest emotions of an undesirable type. Emotions which are to be developed must, as has already been said, find expression. We must act in response to their leadings, else they become but idle vaporings. If love prompts us to say a kind word to a suffering fellow mortal, the word must be spoken, or the feeling itself fades away. On the other hand, the emotions which we wish to suppress are to be refused expression. The unkind and cutting word is to be left unsaid when we are angry, and the fear of things which are harmless left unexpressed and thereby doomed to die. The emotional factor in our environment. Much material for the cultivation of our emotions lies in the everyday life all about us if we can but interpret it. Few indeed of those whom we meet daily, but are hungering for appreciation and sympathy. Lovable traits exist in every character and will reveal themselves to the one who looks for them. Miscarriages of justice abound on all sides and demand our indignation and wrath and the effort to right the wrong. Evil always exists to be hated and suppressed, and dangers to be feared and avoided. Human life and the movement of human affairs constantly appeal to the feeling side of our nature if we understand at all what life and action mean. A certain blindness exists in many people, however, which makes our own little joys or sorrows or fears the most remarkable ones in the world, and keeps us from realizing that others may feel as deeply as we. Of course, this self-centered attitude of mind is fatal to any true cultivation of the emotions. It leads to an emotional life which lacks not only breadth and depth, but also perspective. Literature and the cultivation of the emotions. In order to increase our facility in the interpretation of the emotions through teaching us what to look for in life and experience, we may go to literature. Here we find life interpreted for us, in the ideal, by masters of interpretation. And looking through their eyes, we see new depths and breadths of feeling which we had never before discovered. Indeed, literature deals far more in the aggregate with the feeling side than with any other aspect of human life. And it is just this which makes literature a universal language. For the language of our emotions is more easily interpreted than that of our reason. The smile, the cry, the laugh, the frown, the caress are understood all around the world among all peoples. They are universal. There is always this danger to be avoided, however. We may become so taken up with the overwrought descriptions of the emotions as found in literature or on the stage that the common humdrum of everyday life around us seems flat and stale. The interpretation of the writer or the actor is far beyond what we are able to make for ourselves. So we take their interpretation rather than trouble ourselves to look in our own environment for the material which might appeal to our emotions. It is not rare to find those who easily weep over the woes of an imaginary person in a book or on the stage, unable to feel sympathy for the real suffering which exists all around them. The story is told of a lady at the theater who wept over the suffering of the hero in the play. And at the moment she was shedding the unnecessary tears, her own coachman, whom she had compelled to wait for her in the street, was frozen to death. Our seemingly prosaic environment is full of suggestions to the emotional life, and books and plays should only help to develop in us the power rightly to respond to these suggestions. Harm in emotional overexcitement. Danger may exist also in still another line, namely that of emotional overexcitement. There is a great nervous strain in high emotional tension. Nothing is more exhausting than a severe fit of anger. It leaves its victim weak and limp. A severe case of fright often incapacitates one for mental or physical labor for hours, or it may even result in permanent injury. The whole nervous tone is distinctly lowered by sorrow, and even excessive joy may be harmful. In our actual everyday life, there is little danger from emotional overexcitement unless it be in the case of fear in children, as was shown in the discussion on instincts, and in that of grief over the loss of objects that are dear to us. Most of our childish fears we could just as well avoid if our elders were wiser in the matter of guarding us against those that are unnecessary. The griefs we cannot hope to escape, although we can do much to control them. Long continued emotional excitement, unless it is followed by corresponding activity, gives us those who weep over the wrongs of humanity but never do anything to right them, who are sorry to the point of death over human suffering but cannot be induced to lend their aid to its alleviation. We could very well spare 1,000 of those in the world who merely feel for one who acts, James tells us. We should watch, then, that our good feelings do not simply evaporate as feelings, but that they find some place to apply themselves to accomplish good, that we do not, like Hamlet, rave over wrongs which need to be righted, but never bring ourselves to the point where we take a hand in their righting. If our emotional life is to be rich and deep in its feeling and effective in its results on our acts and character, it must find its outlet in deeds. 4. Emotions as motives. Emotion is always dynamic, and our feelings constitute our strongest motives to action and achievement. How our emotions compel us. Love has often done in the reformation of a fallen life what strength of will was not able to accomplish. It has caused dynasties to fall and has changed the map of nations. Hatred is a motive hardly less strong. Fear will make savage beasts out of men who fall under its sway, causing them to trample helpless women and children under feet, whom in their saner moments they would protect with their lives. Anger puts out all the light of reason and prompts peaceful and well-meaning men to commit murderous acts. Thus, feeling. From the faintest and simplest feeling of interest, the various ranges of pleasures and pain, the sentiments which underlie all of our lives, and so on to the mighty emotions which grip our lives with an overpowering strength, which is constantly urging us on to do and dare. Hence it is important from this standpoint also that we should have the right type of feelings and emotions well developed, and the undesirable ones eliminated. Emotional habits. Emotion and feeling are partly matters of habit. That is, we can form emotional as well as other habits, and they are as hard to break. Anger allowed to run uncontrolled leads into habits of angry outbursts, while the one who habitually controls his temper finds it submitting to the habit of remaining within bounds. One may cultivate the habit of showing his fear on all occasions, or of discouraging its expression. He may form the habit of jealousy or of confidence. It is possible even to form the habit of falling in love, or of so suppressing the tender emotions that love finds little opportunity for expression. And here as elsewhere, habits are formed through performing the acts upon which the habit rests. If there are emotional habits we are desirous of forming, that we have to do is to indulge the emotional expression of the type we desire, and the habit will follow. If we wish to form the habit of living in a chronic state of the blues, then all we have to do is to be blue and act blue sufficiently, and this form of emotional expression will become a part of us. If we desire to form the habit of living in a happy, cheerful state, we can accomplish this by encouraging the corresponding expression. 5. Problems in observation and introspection. 1. What are the characteristic bodily expressions by which you can recognize a state of anger, fear, jealousy, hatred, love, grief? Do you know persons who are inclined to be too expressive emotionally, who show too little emotional expression? How would you classify yourself in this respect? 2. Are you naturally responsive to the emotional tone of others? That is, are you sympathetic? Are you easily affected by reading emotional books, by emotional plays or other appeals? What is the danger from overexciting the emotions without giving them a proper outlet in some practical activity? 3. Have you observed a tendency among adults not to take seriously the emotions of a child? For example, to look upon childish grief as trivial, or fear as something to be laughed at. Is the child's emotional life as real as that of the adult? Parenthetically, see Chapter 9, BETTS, Fathers and Mothers. 4. Have you known children to repress their emotions for fear of being laughed at? Have you known parents or others to remark about childish love affairs to the children themselves in a light or joking way? Ought this ever to be done? 5. Note certain children who give way to fits of anger. What is the remedy? Note other children who cry readily. What would you suggest as a cure? Why should ridicule not be used? 6. Have you observed any teacher using the lesson in literature or history to cultivate the finer emotions? What emotions have you seen appealed to by a lesson in nature study? What emotions have you observed on the playground that needed restraint? Do you think that, on the whole, the emotional life of the child receives enough consideration in the school, in the home? End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of the Mind and its Education. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kassie. The Mind and its Education by George Herbert BETTS. Chapter 16. Interest. The feeling that we call interest is so important a motive in our lives, and so colors our acts and gives direction to our endeavors that we will do well to devote a chapter to its discussion. 1. The nature of interest. We saw in an earlier chapter that personal habits have their rise in race habits or instincts. Let us now see how interest helps the individual to select from his instinctive acts those which are useful to build into personal habits. Instinct impartially starts the child in the performance of many different activities, but does not dictate what particular acts shall be retained to serve as the basis for habits. Interest comes in at this point and says, "This act is of more value than that act. Continue this act and drop that." Instinct prompts the babe to countless movements of body and limb. Interest picks out those that are most vitally connected with the welfare of the organism, and the child comes to prefer these rather than the others. Thus, it is that out of the random movements of arms and legs and head and body, we finally develop the coordinated activities which are infinitely more useful than the random ones were. And these activities, originating in instincts and selected by interest, are soon crystallized into habits. Interest a selective agent. The same truth holds for mental activities as for physical. 1,000 channels lie open for a stream of thought at this moment, but your interest has beckoned it into the one particular channel which, for the time at least, appears to be of the greatest subjective value, and it is now following that channel unless your will has compelled it to leave that for another. Your thinking as naturally follows your interest as the needle does the magnet. Hence, your thought activities are conditioned largely by your interests. This is equivalent to saying that your mental habits rest back finally upon your interests. Everyone knows what it is to be interested, but interest, like other elementary states of consciousness, cannot be rigidly defined. 1. Subjectively considered. Interest may be looked upon as a feeling attitude which assigns our activities their place in a subjective scale of values, and hence selects among them. 2. Objectively considered. An interest is the object which calls forth the feeling. 3. Functionally considered. Interest is the dynamic phase of consciousness. Interest supplies a subjective scale of values. If you are interested in driving a horse rather than in riding a bicycle, it is because the former has a greater subjective value to you than the latter. If you are interested in reading these words instead of thinking about the next social function or the last picnic party, it is because at this moment, the thought suggested appeals to you as of more value than the other lines of thought. From this, it follows that your standards of values are revealed in the character of your interests. The young man who is interested in the racetrack, in gaming, and in low resorts confesses that the fact that these things occupy a high place among the things which appeal to him as subjectively valuable. The mother, whose interests are chiefly in clubs and other social organizations, places these higher in her scale of values than her home. The reader, who can become interested only in light, trashy literature, must admit that matter of this type ranks higher in his subjective scale of values than the works of the masters. Teachers and students, whose strongest interest is in grade marks, value these more highly than true attainment. For whatever may be our claims or assertions, interest is finally an infallible barometer of values we assign to our activities. In the case of some of our feelings, it is not always possible to ascribe an objective side to them. A feeling of ennui, of impending evil, or of bounding vivacity may be produced by an unanalyzable complex of causes. But interest, while it is related primarily to the activities of the self, is carried over from the activity to the object which occasions the activity. That is, interest has both an objective and a subjective side. On the subjective side, a certain activity connected with self-expression is worth so much. On the objective side, a certain object is worth so much as related to this self-expression. Thus we say, I have an interest in books or in business. My daily activities, my self-expression are governed with reference to these objects. They are my interests. Interest dynamic. Many of our milder feelings terminate within ourselves, never attaining sufficient force as motives to impel us to action. Not so with interest. Its very nature is dynamic. Whatever it seizes upon becomes ipso facto an object for some activity, for some form of expression of the self. Are we interested in a new book, we must read it. In a new invention, we must see it, handle it, test it. In some vocation or avocation, we must pursue it. Interest is impulsive. It gives its possessor no opportunity for lethargic rest and quiet, but constantly urges him to action. Grown ardent, interest becomes enthusiasm, without which, says Emerson, nothing great was ever accomplished. Are we an Edison with a strong interest centered in mechanical invention? It will drive us day and night in a ceaseless activity which scarcely gives us time for food and sleep. Are we a Lincoln with an undying interest in the Union? This motive will make possible superhuman efforts for the accomplishment of our end. Are we man or woman anywhere, in any walk of life? So we are dominated by mighty interests grown into enthusiasm for some object. We shall find great purposes growing within us, and our life will be one of activity and achievement. On the contrary, a life which has developed no great interest lacks motive power. Of necessity, such a life must be devoid of purpose and hence barren of results, counting little while it is being lived, and little missed by the world when it is gone. Habit antagonistic to interest. Well, as we have seen, interest is necessary to the formation of habits, yet habits once formed are antagonistic to interest. That is, acts which are so habitually performed that they do themselves are accompanied by a minimum of interest. They come to be done without attentive consciousness, hence interest cannot attach to their performance. Many of the activities which make up the daily round of our lives are of this kind. As long as habit is being modified in some degree, as long as we are improving in our ways of doing things, interest will still cling to the process. But let us once settle into an unmodified rut, and interest quickly fades away. We then have the conditions present which make of us either a machine or a drudge. 2. Direct and indirect interest. We may have an interest either 1. In the doing of an act, or 2. In the end sought through the doing. In the first instance, we call the interest immediate or direct. In the second instance, mediate or indirect. Interest in the end versus interest in the activity. If we do not find an interest in the doing of our work, or if it has become positively disagreeable so that we loathe its performance, then there must be some ultimate end for which the task is being performed, and in which there is a strong interest, else the whole process will be the veriest drudgery. If the end is sufficiently interesting, it may serve to throw a halo of interest over the whole process connected with it. The following instance illustrates this fact. A 12-year-old boy was told by his father that if he would make the body of an automobile at his bench in the manual training school, the father would purchase the running gear for it and give the machine to the boy. In order to secure the coveted prize, the boy had to master the arithmetic necessary for making the calculations, and the drawing necessary for making the plans to scale before the teacher in manual training would allow him to take up the work of construction. The boy had always lacked interest in both arithmetic and drawing, and consequently was dull in them. Under the new incentive, however, he took hold of them with such avidity that he soon surpassed all the remainder of the class and was able to make his calculations and drawings within a term. He secured his automobile a few months later, and still retained his interest in arithmetic and drawing. Indirect interest as a motive. Interest of the indirect type, which does not attach to the process, but comes from some more or less distant end, most of us find much less potent than interest which is immediate. This is especially true unless the end be one of intense desire and not too distant. The assurance to a boy that he must get his lessons well because he will need to be an educated man 10 years hence when he goes into business for himself does not compensate for the lack of interest in the lessons of today. Yet it is necessary in the economy of life that both children and adults should learn to work under the incitement of indirect interests. Much of the work we do is for an end which is more desirable than the work itself. It will always be necessary to sacrifice present pleasure for future good. Ability to work cheerfully for a somewhat distant end saves much of our work from becoming drudgery. If interest is removed from both the process and the end, no inducement is left to work except compulsion, and this, if continued, results in the lowest type of effort. It puts a man on a level with the beast of burden, which constantly shirks its work. Indirect interest alone insufficient. Interest coming from an end instead of inhering in the process may finally lead to an interest in the work itself. But if it does not, the worker is in danger of being left a drudge at last. To be more than a slave to his work, one must ultimately find the work worth doing for its own sake. The man who performs his work solely because he has a wife and babies at home will never be an artist in his trade or profession. The student who masters a subject only because he must know it for an examination is not developing the traits of a scholar. The question of interest in the process makes the difference between the one who works because he loves to work and the one who toils because he must. It makes the difference between the artist and the drudge. The drudge does only what he must when he works, the artist all he can. The drudge longs for the end of labor, the artist for it to begin. The drudge studies how he may escape his labor, the artist how he may better his and ennoble it. To labor when there is joy in the work is elevating. To labor under the lash of compulsion is degrading. It matters not so much what a man's occupation as how it is performed. A coachman driving his team down the crowded street better than anyone else could do it, and glorying in that fact, may be a true artist in his occupation, and be ennobled through his work. A statesman molding the affairs of a nation as no one else could do it, or a scholar leading the thought of his generation is subject to the same law. In order to give the best grade of service of which he is capable, man must find a joy in the performance of the work as well as in the end sought through its performance. No matter how high the position or how refined the worker becomes a slave to his labor unless interest in its performance saves him. 3. Transitoriness of certain interests. Since our interests are always connected with our activities, it follows that many interests will have their birth, grow to full strength, and then fade away as the corresponding instincts which are responsible for the activities pass through these same stages. This only means that interest in play develops at the time when the play activities are seeking expression, that interest in the opposite sex becomes strong when instinctive tendencies are directing the attention to the choice of a mate, and that interest in abstract studies comes when the development of the brain enables us to carry on logical trains of thought. All of us can recall many interests which were once strong and are now weak or else have altogether passed away. Hide and seek, Pussy wants a corner, excursions to the little fishing pond, securing the colored chromo at school, the care of pets, reading blood and thunder stories or sentimental ones. Interest in these things belongs to our past or has left but a faint shadow. Other interests have come, and these in turn will also disappear and other new ones yet appear as long as we keep on acquiring new experience. Interests must be utilized when they appear. This means that we must take advantage of interests when they appear if we wish to utilize and develop them. How many people there are who at one time felt an interest impelling them to cultivate their taste for music, art, or literature and said they would do this at some convenient season, and finally found themselves without a taste for these things? How many of us have felt an interest in some benevolent work, but at last discovered that our inclination had died before we found time to help the cause? How many of us, young as we are, do not at this moment lament the passing of some interest from our lives, or are now watching the dying of some interest which we had fondly supposed was as stable as Gibraltar? The drawings of every interest which appeals to us is a voice crying, "Now is the appointed time." What impulse urges us today to become or to do? We must begin at once to be or perform if we would attain to the coveted end. The value of a strong interest. Nor are we to look upon these transitory interests as useless. They come to us not only as a race heritage, but they impel us to activities which are immediately useful, or else prepare us for the later battles of life. But even aside from this important fact, it is worth everything just to be interested. For it is only through the impulsion of interest that we first learn to put forth effort in any true sense of the word, and interest furnishes the final foundation upon which volition rests. Without interest, the greatest powers may slumber in us unawakened, and abilities capable of the highest attainment rest satisfied with commonplace mediocrity. No one will ever know how many Gladstones and Leibnizes the world has lost simply because their interests were never appealed to in such a way as to start them on the road to achievement. It matters less what the interest be, so it be not bad, than that there shall be some great interest to compel endeavor, test the strength of endurance, and lead to habits of achievement. 4. Selection among our interests. I said early in the discussion that interest is selective among our activities, picking out those which appear to be of the most value to us. In the same manner, there must be a selection among our interests themselves. The mistake of following too many interests. It is possible for us to become interested in so many lines of activity that we do none of them well. This leads to a life so full of hurry and stress that we forget life in our busy living. Says James with respect to the necessity of making a choice among our interests. With most objects of desire, physical nature restricts our choice to but one of many represented goods, and even so it is here. I am often confronted by the necessity of standing by one of my empirical selves and relinquishing the rest. Not that I would not, if I could, be both handsome and fat, and well-dressed, and a great athlete, and make $1 million a year, be a wit, a bon vivant, and a lady killer, as well as a philosopher, a philanthropist, statesman, warrior, and African explorer, as well as a tone poet and saint. But the thing is simply impossible. The millionaire's work would run counter to the saint's. The bon vivant and the philosopher and the lady killer could not well keep house in the same tenement of clay. Such different characters may conceivably, at the outset of life, be alike possible to man, but to make any one of them actual, the rest must more or less be suppressed. The seeker of his truest, strongest, deepest self must review the least carefully and pick out the one on which to stake his salvation. Interests may be too narrow. On the other hand, it is just as possible for our interests to be too narrow as too broad. The one who has cultivated no interests outside his daily run of humdrum activities does not get enough out of life. It is possible to become so engrossed with making a living that we forget to live, to become so habituated to some narrow treadmill of labor with the limited field of thought suggested by its environment, that we miss the richest experiences of life. Many there are who live a barren, trivial, and self-centered life because they fail to see the significant and the beautiful which lie just beyond where their interests reach. Many there are so taken up with their own petty troubles that they have no heart or sympathy for fellow humanity. Many there are so absorbed with their own little achievements that they fail to catch step with the progress of the age. Specialization should not come too early. It is not well to specialize too early in our interests. We miss too many rich fields which lie ready for the harvesting, and whose gleaning would enrich our lives. The student who is so buried in books that he has no time for athletic recreations or social diversions is making a mistake equally with the one who is so enthusiastic an athlete and social devotee that he neglects his studies. Likewise, the youth who is so taken up with the study of one particular line that he applies himself to this at the expense of all other lines is inviting a distorted growth. Youth is the time for pushing the skyline back on all sides. It is the time for cultivating diverse and varied lines of interests if we would grow into a rich experience in our later lives. The physical must be developed, but not at the expense of the mental and vice versa. The social must not be neglected, but it must not be indulged to such an extent that other interests suffer. Interest in amusements and recreations should be cultivated, but these should never run counter to the moral and religious. Specialization is necessary, but specialization in our interests should rest upon a broad field of fundamental interests, in order that the selection of the special line may be an intelligent one, and that our specialty shall not prove a rut in which we become so deeply buried that we are lost to the best in life. A proper balance to be sought. It behooves us, then, to find a proper balance in cultivating our interests, making them neither too broad nor too narrow. We should deliberately seek to discover those which are strong enough to point the way to a life vocation, but this should not be done until we have had an opportunity to become acquainted with various lines of interests. Otherwise, our decision in this important matter may be based merely on a whim. We should also decide what interests we should cultivate for our own personal development and happiness, and for the service we are to render in a sphere outside our immediate vocation. We should consider avocations as well as vocations. Whatever interests are selected should be carried to efficiency. Better a reasonable number of carefully selected interests, well developed and resulting in efficiency, than a multitude of interests which lead us into so many fields that we can at best get but a smattering of each, and that by neglecting the things which should mean the most to us. Our interests should lead us to live what Wagner calls a simple life, but not a narrow one. 5. Interest fundamental in education. Some educators have feared that in finding our occupations interesting, we shall lose all power of effort and self-direction, that the will, not being called sufficiently into requisition, must suffer from non-use, that we shall come to do the interesting and agreeable things well enough, but fail before the disagreeable. Interest not antagonistic to effort. The best development of the will does not come through our being forced to do acts in which there is absolutely no interest. Work done under compulsion never secures the full self in its performance. It is done mechanically and usually under such a spirit of rebellion on the part of the doer, that the advantage of such training may well be doubted. Nor are we safe in assuming that tasks done without interest, as the motive, are always performed under the direction of the will. It is far more likely that they are done under some external compulsion, and that the will has, after all, but very little to do with it. A boy may get an uninteresting lesson at school without much pressure from his will, providing he is sufficiently afraid of the master. In order that the will may receive training through compelling the performance of certain acts, it must have a reasonably free field, with external pressure removed. The compelling force must come from within and not from without. On the other hand, there is not the least danger that we shall ever find a place in life where all the disagreeable is removed, and all phases of our work made smooth and interesting. The necessity will always be rising to call upon effort to take up the fight and hold us to duty where interest has failed. And it is just here that there must be no failure, else we shall be mere creatures of circumstance, drifting with every eddy in the tide of our life, and never able to breast the current. Interest is not to supplant the necessity for stern and strenuous endeavor, but rather to call forth the largest measure of endeavor of which the self is capable. It is to put at work a larger amount of power than can be secured in any other way. In place of supplanting the will, it is to give it its point of departure and render its service all the more effective. Interest and character. Finally, we are not to forget that bad interests have the same propulsive power as good ones, and will lead to acts just as surely. And these acts will just as readily be formed into habits. It is worth noticing that back of the act lies an interest. In the act lies the seed of a habit. Ahead of the act lies behavior, which grows into conduct, this into character, and character into destiny. Bad interests should be shunned and discouraged. But even that is not enough. Good interests must be installed in the place of the bad ones from which we wish to escape, for it is through substitution rather than suppression that we are able to break from the bad and adhere to the good. Our interests are an evolution. Out of the simple interests of the child grow the more complex interests of the man. Lacking the opportunity to develop the interests of childhood, the man will come somewhat short of the full interests of manhood. The great thing, then, in educating a child is to discover the fundamental interests which come to him from the race and, using these as a starting point, direct them into constantly broadening and more serviceable ones. Out of the early interest in play is to come the later interest in work. Out of the early interest in collecting treasure boxes full of worthless trinkets and old scraps comes the later interest in earning and retaining ownership of property. Out of the interest in chums and playmates come the larger social interests. Out of interest in nature comes the interest of the naturalist. And so one by one, we may examine the interests which bear the largest fruit in our adult life. And we find that they all have their roots in some early interest of childhood, which was encouraged and given a chance to grow. 6. Order of development of our interests. The order in which our interests develop thus becomes an important question in our education. Nor is the order an arbitrary one, as might appear on the first thought, for interest follows the invariable law of attaching to the activity for which the organism is at that time ready, and which it then needs in its further growth. That we are sometimes interested in harmful things does not disprove this assertion. The interest in its fundamental aspect is good, and but needs more healthful environment or more wise direction. While space forbids a full discussion of the genetic phase of interest here, yet we may profit by a brief statement of the fundamental interests of certain well-marked periods in our development. The interests of early childhood. The interests of early childhood are chiefly connected with ministering to the wants of the organism as expressed in the appetites, and in securing control of the larger muscles. Activity is the preeminent thing. Racing and romping are worth doing for their own sake alone. Imitation is strong. Curiosity is rising, and imagination is building a new world. Speech is a joy, language is learned with ease, and rhyme and rhythm become second nature. The interests of this stage are still very direct and immediate. A distant end does not attract. The thing must be worth doing for the sake of the doing. Since the young child's life is so full of action, and since it is out of acts that habits grow, it is doubly desirous during this period that environment, models, and teaching should all direct his interests and activities into lines that will lead to permanent values. The interests of later childhood. In the period from second dentition to puberty, there is a great widening in the scope of interests, as well as a noticeable change in their character. Activity is still the keynote, but the child is no longer interested merely in the doing, but is now able to look forward to the end sought. Interests, which are somewhat indirect, now appeal to him, and the how of things attracts his attention. He is beginning to reach outside of his own little circle and is ready for handicraft, reading, history, and science. Spelling, writing, and arithmetic interest him partly from the activities involved, but more as a means to an end. Interest in complex games and plays increases, but the child is not yet ready for games which require teamwork. He has not come to the point where he is willing to sacrifice himself for the good of all. Interest in moral questions is beginning, and right and wrong are no longer things which may or may not be done without rebuke or punishment. The great problem at this stage is to direct the interest into ways of adapting the means to ends, and into willingness to work under voluntary attention for the accomplishment of the desired end. The interests of adolescence. Finally, with the advent of puberty, comes the last stage in the development of interests before adult life. This period is not marked by the birth of new interests so much as by a deepening and broadening of those already begun. The end sought becomes an increasingly larger factor, whether in play or in work. Mere activity itself no longer satisfies. The youth can now play team games, for his social interests are taking shape, and he can subordinate himself for the good of the group. Interest in the opposite sex takes on a new face, and social form and mode of dress receive attention. A new consciousness of self emerges, and the youth becomes introspective. Questions of the ultimate meaning of things press for solution, and what and who am I demands an answer. At this age, we pass from a regime of obedience to one of self-control, from an ethics of authority to one of individualism. All the interests are now taking on a more definite and stable form, and are looking seriously towards life vocations. This is a time of big plans and strenuous activity. It is a crucial period in our life, fraught with pitfalls and dangers, with privileges and opportunities. At this strategic point in our life's voyage, we may anchor ourselves with right interests to a safe manhood and a successful career, or we may, with wrong interests, bind ourselves to a broken life of discouragement and defeat. 7. Problems in observation and introspection. 1. Try making a list of your most important interests in order of their strength. Suppose you had made such a list 5 years ago. Where would it have differed from the present list? Are you ever obliged to perform any activities in which you have little or no interest, either directly or indirectly? Can you name any activities in which you once had a strong interest, but which you now perform chiefly from force of habit and without much interest? 2. Have you any interests of which you are not proud? On the other hand, do you lack certain interests which you feel that you should possess? What interests are you now trying especially to cultivate, to suppress? Have you as broad a field of interests as you can well take care of? Have you so many interests that you are slighting the development of some of the more important ones? 3. Observe several recitations for differences in the amount of interest shown. Account for these differences. Have you ever observed an enthusiastic teacher with an uninterested class? A dull, listless teacher with an interested class? 4. A father offers his son $1 for every grade on his term report, which is above 90. What type of interest relative to studies does this appeal to? What do you think of the advisability of giving prizes in connection with schoolwork? 5. Most children in the elementary school are not interested in technical grammar. Why not? Histories made up chiefly of dates and lists of kings or presidents are not interesting. What is the remedy? Would you call any teaching of literature, history, geography, or science successful which fails to develop an interest in the subject? 6. After careful observation, make a statement of the differences in the typical play interests of boys and girls, of children of the 3rd grade and the 8th grade. End of Chapter 16. Recording by Kassie.
Chapter 17 of The Mind and Its Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mind and Its Education by George Herbert BETTS. Chapter 17. The Will. The fundamental fact in all ranges of life, from the lowest to the highest, is activity, doing. Every individual, either animal or man, is constantly meeting situations which demand response. In the lower forms of life, this response is very simple, while in the higher forms, and especially in man, it is very complex. The bird sees a nook favorable for a nest and at once appropriates it. A man sees a house that strikes his fancy and works and plans and saves for months to secure money with which to buy it. It is evident that the larger the possible number of responses and the greater their diversity and complexity, the more difficult it will be to select and compel the right response to any given situation. Man therefore needs some special power of control over his acts. He requires a will. 1. The nature of the will. There has been much discussion and not a little controversy as to the true nature of the will. Just what is the will, and what is the content of our mental stream when we are in the act of willing? Is there, at such times, a new and distinctly different content which we do not find in our processes of knowledge or emotion, such as perception, memory, judgment, interest, desire? Or do we find, when we are engaged in an act of the will, that the mental stream contains only the familiar old elements of attention, perception, judgment, desire, purpose, etc., all organized or set for the purpose of accomplishing or preventing some act? The content of the will. We shall not attempt here to settle the controversy suggested by the foregoing questions, nor, for immediately practical purposes, do we need to settle it. It is perhaps safe to say, however, that whenever we are willing, the mental content consists of elements of cognition and feeling, plus a distinct sense of effort with which everyone is familiar. Whether this sense of effort is a new and different element, or only a complex of old and familiar mental processes, we need not now decide. The function of the will. Concerning the function of the will, there can be no haziness or doubt. Volition concerns itself wholly with acts, responses. The will always has to do with causing or inhibiting some action, either physical or mental. We need to go to the dentist, tell some friend we were in the wrong, hold our mind to a difficult or uninteresting task, or do some other disagreeable thing from which we shirk. It is at such points that we must call upon the will. Again, we must restrain our tongue from speaking the unkind word, keep from crying out when the dentist drills the tooth, check some unworthy line of thought. We must here also appeal to the will. We may conclude, then, that the will is needed whenever the physical or mental activity must be controlled with effort. Some writers have called the work of the will in compelling action its positive function, and in inhibiting action its negative function. How the will exerts its compulsion. How does the will bring its compulsion to bear? It is not a kind of mental policeman who can take us by the collar, so to speak, and say, do this or do not do that. The secret of the will's power of control lies in attention. It is the line of action that we hold the mind upon with an attitude of intending to perform it, that we finally follow. It is the thing we keep thinking about that we finally do. On the other hand, let us resolutely hold the mind away from some attractive but unsuitable line of action, directing our thoughts to an opposite course or to some wholly different subject, and we have effectually blocked the wrong response. To control our acts is therefore to control our thoughts, and strength of will can be measured by our ability to direct our attention. 2. The extent of voluntary control over our acts. A relatively small proportion of our acts or responses are controlled by volition. Nature, in her wise economy, has provided a simpler and easier method than to have all our actions performed or checked with conscious effort. Classes of acts or response. Movements or acts, like other phenomena, do not just happen. They never occur without a cause back of them. Whether they are performed with a conscious end in view or without it, the fact remains the same. Something must lie back of the act to account for its performance. During the last hour, each of us has performed many simple movements and more or less complex acts. These acts have varied greatly in character. Of many, we were wholly unconscious. Others were consciously performed, but without feeling of effort on our part. Still others were accomplished only with effort, and after a struggle to decide which of two lines of action we should take. Some of our acts were reflex, some were chiefly instinctive, and some were volitional. Simple reflex acts. First, there are going on within every living organism countless movements of which he is in large part unconscious, which he does nothing to initiate, and which he is largely powerless to prevent. Some of them are wholly, and others almost, out of the reach and power of his will. Such are the movements of the heart and vascular system, the action of the lungs in breathing, the movements of the digestive tract, the work of the various glands in their process of secretion. The entire organism is a mass of living matter, and just because it is living, no part of it is at rest. Movements of this type require no external stimulus and no direction. They are reflex. They take care of themselves as long as the body is in health, without let or hindrance, continuing whether we sleep or wake, even if we are in hypnotic or anesthetic coma. With movements of reflex type, we shall have no more concern, since they are almost wholly physiological and come scarcely at all within the range of the consciousness. Instinctive acts. Next, there are a large number of such acts as closing the eyes when they are threatened, starting back from danger, crying out from pain or alarm, frowning and striking when angry. These may roughly be classed as instinctive, and have already been discussed under that head. They differ from the former class in that they require some stimulus to set the act off. We are fully conscious of their performance, although they are performed without a conscious end in view. Winking the eyes serves an important purpose, but that is not why we wink. Starting back from danger is a wise thing to do, but we do not stop to consider this before performing the act. And so it is with a multitude of reflex and instinctive acts. They are performed immediately upon receiving an appropriate stimulus, because we possess an organism calculated to act in a definite way in response to certain stimuli. There is no need for, and indeed no place for, anything to come in between the stimulus and the act. The stimulus pulls the trigger of the ready-set nervous system, and the act follows at once. Acts of these reflex and instinctive types do not come properly within the range of volition, hence we will not consider them further. Automatic or spontaneous acts. Growing out of these reflex and instinctive acts is a broad field of action which may be called automatic or spontaneous. The distinguishing feature of this type of action is that all such acts, though performed now largely without conscious purpose or intent, were at one time purposed acts, performed with effort. This is to say that they were volitional. Such acts as writing or fingering the keyboard of a piano were once consciously purposed volitional acts selected from many random or reflex movements. The effects of experience and habit are such, however, that soon the mere presence of pencil and paper, or the sight of the keyboard, is enough to set one scribbling or playing. Stated differently, certain objects and situations come to suggest certain characteristic acts or responses so strongly that the action follows immediately on the heels of the percept of the object, or the idea of the act. James calls such action ideomotor. Many illustrations of this type of acts will occur to each of us. A door starts to blow shut, and we spring up and avert the slam. The memory of a neglected engagement comes to us, and we have started to our feet on the instant. A dish of nuts stands before us, and we find ourselves nibbling without intending to do so. The cycle from volitional to automatic. It is of course evident that no such acts, though they were at one time in our experience volitional, now require effort or definite intention for their performance. The law covering this point may be stated as follows. All volitional acts, when repeated, tend, through the effects of habit, to become automatic, and thus relieve the will from the necessity of directing them. To illustrate this law, try the following experiment. Draw on a piece of cardboard a star like figure 19, making each line segment 2 inches. Seat yourself at a table with the star before you, placing a mirror back of the star so that it can be seen in the mirror. Have someone hold a screen a few inches above the table so as to hide the star from your direct view, but so that you can see it in the mirror. Now reach your hand under the screen and trace with a pencil around the star from left to right, not taking your pencil off the paper until you get clear around. Keep track of how long it takes to go around, and also note the irregular wanderings of your pencil. Try this experiment 5 times over, noting the decrease in time and effort required and the increase in efficiency as the movements tend to become automatic. Volitional action. While it is obvious that the various types of action already described include a very large proportion of all our acts, yet they do not include all. For there are some acts that are neither reflex nor instinctive nor automatic, but that have to be performed under the stress of compulsion and effort. We constantly meet situations where the necessity for action or restraint runs counter to our inclinations. We daily are confronted by the necessity of making decisions in which the mind must be compelled by effort to take this direction or that direction. Conflicting motives or tendencies create frequent necessity for coercion. It is often necessary to drive our bark counter to the current of our desires or our habits, or to enter into conflict with a temptation. Volition acts in the making of decisions. Everyone knows for himself the state of inward unrest which we call indecision. A thought enters the mind which would of itself prompt an act, but before the act can occur, a contrary idea appears, and the act is checked. Another thought comes favoring the act, and is in turn counterbalanced by an opposing one. The impelling and inhibiting ideas we call motives or reasons for and against the proposed act. While we are balancing the motives against each other, we are said to deliberate. This process of deliberation must go on, if we continue to think about the matter at all, until one set of ideas has triumphed over the other and secured the attention. When this has occurred, we have decided, and the deliberation is at an end. we have exercised the highest function of the will and made a choice. Sometimes the battle of motives is short, the decision being reached as soon as there is time to summon all the reasons on both sides of the question. At other times, the conflict may go on at intervals for days or weeks, neither set of motives being strong enough to vanquish the other and dictate the decision. When the motives are somewhat evenly balanced, we wisely pause in making a decision, because when one line of action is taken, the other cannot be, and we hesitate to lose either opportunity. A state of indecision is usually highly unpleasant, and no doubt more than one decision has been hastened in our lives simply that we might be done with the unpleasantness attendant on the consideration of two contrary and insistent sets of motives. It is of the highest importance when making a decision of any consequence that we should be fair in considering all the reasons on both sides of the question, allowing each its just weight. Nor is this as easy as it might appear, for, as we saw in our study of the emotions, our feeling attitude toward any object that occupies the mind is largely responsible for the subjective value we place upon it. It is easy to be so prejudiced toward or against a line of action that the motives bearing upon it cannot get fair consideration. To be able to eliminate this personal factor to such an extent that the evidence before us on a question may be considered on its merits is a rare accomplishment. Types of decision. A decision may be reached in a variety of ways, the most important ones of which may now briefly be described after the general plan suggested by Professor James. The reasonable type. One of the simplest types of decision is that in which the preponderance of motives is clearly seen to be on one side or the other, and the only rational thing to do is to decide in accordance with the weight of evidence. Decisions of this type are called reasonable. If we discover 10 reasons why we should pursue a certain course of action, and only 1 or 2 reasons of equal weight why we should not, then the decision ought not to be hard to make. The points to watch in this case are A, that we have really discovered all the important reasons on both sides of the case, and B, that our feelings of personal interest or prejudice have not given some of the motives an undue weight in our scale of values. Accidental type, external motives. It is to be doubted whether as many of our decisions are made under immediate stress of volition as we think. We may be hesitating between 2 sets of motives, unable to decide between them, when a third factor enters which is not really related to the question at all, but which finally dictates the decision nevertheless. For example, we are considering the question whether we shall go on an excursion or stay at home and complete a piece of work. The benefits coming from the recreation and the pleasures of the trip are pitted against the expense which must be incurred and the desirability of having the work done on time. At this point, while as yet we have been unable to decide, a friend comes along and we seek to evade the responsibility of making our own decision by appealing to him, "You tell me what to do." How few of us have never said in effect, if not in words, "I will do this or that if you will." How few have never taken advantage of a rainy day to stay from church or shirk an undesirable engagement? How few have not allowed important questions to be decided by some trivial or accidental factor not really related to the choice in the least? This form of decision is accidental decision. It does not rest on motives which are vitally related to the case, but rather on the accident of external circumstances. The person who habitually makes his decisions in this way lacks power of will. He does not hold himself to the question until he has gathered the evidence before him, and then himself direct his attention to the best line of action, and so secure its performance. He drifts with the tide, he goes with the crowd, he shirks responsibility. Accidental type, subjective motives. A second type of accidental decision may occur when we are hesitating between two lines of action which are seemingly about equally desirable, and no preponderating motive enters the field. When no external factor appears, and no advising friend comes to the rescue. Then, with the necessity for deciding thrust upon us, we tire of the worry and strain of deliberation, and say to ourselves, "This thing must be settled one way or the other pretty soon. I am tired of the whole matter." When we have reached this point, we are likely to shut our eyes to the evidence in the case, and decide largely upon the whim or mood of the moment. Very likely we regret our decision the next instant, but without any more cause for the regret than we had for the decision. It is evident that such a decision as this does not rest on valid motives, but rather on the accident of subjective conditions. Habitual decisions of this type are an evidence of a mental laziness or a mental incompetence which renders the individual incapable of marshalling the facts bearing on a case. He cannot hold them before his mind and weigh them against each other until one side outweighs the other and dictates the decision. Of course, the remedy for this weakness of decision lies in not allowing oneself to be pushed into a decision simply to escape the unpleasantness of a state of indecision, or the necessity of searching for further evidence which will make the decision easier. On the other hand, it is possible to form a habit of indecision, of undue hesitancy in coming to conclusions when the evidence is all before us. This gives us the mental dawdler, the person who will spend several minutes in an agony of indecision over whether to carry an umbrella on this particular trip, whether to wear black shoes or tan shoes today, whether to go calling or to stay at home and write letters this afternoon. Such a person is usually in a stew over some inconsequential matter, and consumes so much time and energy in fussing over trivial things that he is incapable of handling larger ones. If we are certain that we have all the facts in a given case before us, and have given each its due weight so far as our judgment will enable us to do, then there is nothing to be gained by delaying the decision. Nor is there any occasion to change the decision after it has once been made, unless new evidence is discovered bearing on the case. Decision under effort. The highest type of decision is that in which effort is the determining factor. The pressure of external circumstances and inward impulse is not enough to overcome a calm and determined "I will." Two possible lines of action may lie open before us. Every current of our being leads toward the one. In addition, inclination, friends, honors, all beckon in the same direction. From the other course our very nature shrinks. Duty alone bids us take this line, and promises no rewards except the approval of conscience. Here is the crucial point in human experience, the supreme test of the individual, the last measure of man's independence and power. Winning at this point, man has exercised his highest prerogative, that of independent choice. Failing here, he reverts toward the lower forms and is a creature of circumstance, no longer the master of his own destiny, but blown about by the winds of chance. And it behooves us to win in this battle. We may lose in a contest or a game, and yet not fail, because we have done our best. If we fail in the conflict of motives, we have planted a seed of weakness from which we shall at last harvest defeat. Jean Valjean, the galley slave of almost a score of years, escapes and lives an honest life. He wins the respect and admiration of friends. He is elected mayor of his town, and honors are heaped on him. At the height of his prosperity, he reads one day that a man has been arrested in another town for the escaped convict Jean Valjean, and is about to be sent to the galleys. Now comes the supreme test in Jean Valjean's life. Shall he remain the honored, respected citizen, and let an innocent man suffer in his stead, or shall he proclaim himself the long-sought criminal, and again have the collar riveted on his neck, and take his place at the oars? He spends one awful night of conflict, in which contending motives make a battleground of his soul. But in the morning he has won. He has saved his manhood. His conscience yet lives. And he goes and gives himself up to the officers. Nor could he do otherwise and still remain a man. 3. Strong and weak wills. Many persons will admit that their memory or imagination or power of perception is not good, but few will confess to a weak will. Strength of will is everywhere lauded as a mark of worth and character. How can we tell whether our will is strong or weak? Not a will, but wills. First of all, we need to remember that, just as we do not have a memory, but a system of memories, so we do not possess a will, but many different wills. By this I mean that the will must be called upon and tested at every point of contact in experience before we have fully measured its strength. Our will may have served us reasonably well so far, But we may not yet have met any great number of hard tests because our experience and temptations have been limited. Nor must we forget to take into account both the negative and the positive functions of the will. Many there are who think of the will chiefly in its negative use, as a kind of a check or barrier to save us from doing certain things. That this is an important function cannot be denied, but the positive is the higher function. There are many men and women who are able to resist evil, but able to do little good. They are good enough, but not good for much. They lack the power of effort and self-compulsion to hold them up to the high standards and stern endeavor necessary to save them from inferiority or mediocrity. It is almost certain that for most who read these words, the greatest test of their willpower will be in the positive instead of the negative direction. Objective tests a false measure of willpower. The actual amount of volition exercised in making a decision cannot be measured by objective results. The fact that you follow the pathway of duty, while I falter and finally drift into the byways of pleasure, is not certain evidence that you have put forth the greater power of will. In the first place, the allurements which led me astray may have had no charms for you. Furthermore, you may have so formed the habit of pursuing the pathway of duty when the two paths opened before you, that your well-trained feet unerringly led you into the narrow way without a struggle. Of course, you are on safer ground than I, and on ground that we should all seek to attain. But, nevertheless, I, although I fell when I should have stood, may have been fighting a battle and manifesting a power of resistance of which you, under similar temptation, would have been incapable. The only point from which a conflict of motives can be safely judged is that of the soul which is engaged in the struggle. 4. Volitional types. Several fairly well-marked volitional types may be discovered. It is, of course, to be understood that these types all grade by insensible degrees into each other, and that extreme types are the exception rather than the rule. The impulsive type. The impulsive type of will goes along with a nervous organism of the hair-trigger kind. The brain is in a state of highly unstable equilibrium, and a relatively slight current serves to set off the motor centers. Action follows before there is time for a counteracting current to intervene. Putting it in mental terms, we act on an idea which presents itself before an opposing one has an opportunity to enter the mind. Hence, the action is largely or wholly ideomotor, and but slightly or not at all deliberate. It is this type of will which results in the hasty word or deed, or the rash act committed on the impulse of the moment and repented of at leisure, which compels the frequent, "I didn't think," or "I would not have done it." The impulsive person may undoubtedly have credited up to him many kind words and noble deeds. In addition, he usually carries with him an air of spontaneity and wholeheartedness, which goes far to atone for his faults. The fact remains, however, that he is too little the master of his acts that he is guided too largely by external circumstances or inward caprice. He lacks balance. Impulsive action is not to be confused with quick decision and rapid action. Many of the world's greatest and safest leaders have been noted for quickness of decision and for rapidity of action in carrying out their decisions. It must be remembered, however, that these men were making decisions in fields well known to them. They were specialists in this line of deliberation. The motives for and against certain lines of action had often been dwelt upon. All possible contingencies had been imaged many times over, and evaluation placed upon the different decisions. The various concepts had long been associated with certain definite lines of action. Deliberation under such conditions can be carried on with lightning rapidity, each motive being checked off as worth so much the instant it presents itself, and action can follow immediately when attention settles on the proper motive to govern the decision. This is not impulse, but abbreviated deliberation. These facts suggest to us that we should think much and carefully over matters in which we are required to make quick decisions. Of course, the remedy for the over-impulsive type is to cultivate deliberative action. When the impulse comes to act without consideration, pause to give the other side of the question an opportunity to be heard. Check the motor response to ideas that suggest action until you have reviewed the field to see whether there are contrary reasons to be taken into account. Form the habit of waiting for all evidence before deciding. Think twice before you act. The obstructed will. The opposite of the impulsive type of will is the obstructed or balky will. In this type, there is too much inhibition or else not enough impulsion. Images which should result in action are checkmated by opposing images, or do not possess vitality enough as motives to overcome the dead weight of inertia which clogs mental action. The person knows well enough what he should do, but he cannot get started. He cannot get the consent of his will. It may be the student whose mind is tormented by thoughts of coming failure in recitation or examination, but who yet cannot force himself to the exertion necessary safely to meet the ordeal. It may be the dissolute man who tortures himself in his sober moments with remorse and the thought that he was intended for better things, but who, waking from his meditations, goes on in the same old way. It may be the child undergoing punishment, who is to be released from bondage as soon as he will promise to be good, but who cannot bring himself to say the necessary words. It not only may be, but is, man or woman anywhere who has ideals which are known to be worthy and noble, but which fail to take hold. It is anyone who is following a course of action which he knows is beneath him. No one can doubt that the moral tragedies, the failures and the shipwrecks in life come far more from the breaking of the bonds which should bind right ideals to action than from a failure to perceive the truth. Men differ far more in their deeds than in their standards of action. The remedy for this diseased type of will is much easier to prescribe than to apply. It is simply to refuse to attend to the contrary thoughts which are blocking action, and to cultivate and encourage those which lead to action of the right kind. It is seeking to vitalize our good impulses and render them effective by acting on them whenever opportunity offers. Nothing can be accomplished by moodily dwelling on the disgrace of harboring the obstructing ideas. Thus, brooding over them only encourages them. What we need is to get entirely away from the line of thought in which we have met our obstruction, and approach the matter from a different direction. The child who is in a fit of sulks does not so much need a lecture on the disagreeable habit he is forming as to have his thoughts led into lines not connected with the grievance which is causing him the trouble. The stubborn child does not need to have his will broken, but rather to have it strengthened. He may be compelled to do what he does not want to do, but if this is accomplished through physical force, instead of by leading to thoughts connected with the performance of the act, it may be doubted whether the will has in any degree been strengthened. Indeed, it may rather be depended upon that the will has been weakened, for an opportunity for self-control, through which alone the will develops, has been lost. The ultimate remedy for rebellion often lies in greater freedom at the proper time. This does not mean that the child should not obey rightful authority promptly and explicitly, but that just as little external authority as possible should intervene to take from the child the opportunity for self-compulsion. The normal will. The golden mean between these two abnormal types of will may be called the normal or balanced will. Here there is a proper ratio between impulsion and inhibition. Ideas are not acted upon the instant they enter the mind without giving time for a survey of the field of motives. Neither is action sicklied or, with the pale cast of thought, to such an extent that it becomes impossible. The evidence is all considered, and each motive fully weighed. But this, once done, decision follows. No dilatory and obstructive tactics are allowed. The fleeting impulse is not enough to persuade to action, neither is action unduly delayed after the decision is made. 5. Training the will. The will is to be trained as we train the other powers of the mind, through the exercise of its normal function. The function of the will is to direct or control in the actual affairs of life. Many well-meaning persons speak of training the will as if we could separate it from the interests and purposes of our daily living, and in some way put it through its paces merely for the sake of adding to its general strength. This view is all wrong. There is, as we have seen, no such thing as general power of will. Will is always required in specific acts and emergencies, and it is precisely upon such matters that it must be exercised if it is to be cultivated. Will to be trained in common round of duties. What is needed in developing the will is a deep moral interest in whatever we set out to do, and a high purpose to do it up to the limit of our powers. Without this, any artificial exercises, no matter how carefully they are devised or how heroically they are carried out, cannot but fail to fit us for the real tests of life. With it, artificial exercises are superfluous. It matters not so much what our vocation as how it is performed. The most commonplace human experience is rich in opportunities for the highest form of expression possible to the will, that of directing us into right lines of action, and of holding us to our best in the accomplishment of some dominant purpose. There is no one set form of exercise which alone will serve to train the will. The student pushing steadily toward his goal in spite of poverty and grinding labor. The teacher who, though unappreciated and poorly paid, yet performs every duty with conscientious thoroughness. The man who stands firm in the face of temptation. The person whom heredity or circumstance has handicapped, but who nevertheless courageously fights his battle. The countless men and women everywhere whose names are not known to fame, but who stand in the hard places, bearing the heat and the toil with brave, unflinching hearts. These are the ones who are developing a moral fiber and strength of will which will stand in the day of stress. Better 1,000 times such training as this, in the thick of life's real conflicts, than any volitional calisthenics or priggish self-denials entered into solely for the training of the will. School work and will training. The work of the school offers as good an opportunity for training powers of will as of memory or reasoning. On the side of inhibition, there is always the necessity for self-restraint and control, so that the rights of others may not be infringed upon. Temptations to unfairness or insincerity in lessons and examinations are always to be met. The social relations of the school necessitate the development of personal poise and independence. On the positive side, the opportunities for the exercise of willpower are always at hand in the school. Every lesson gives the pupil a chance to measure his strength and determination against the resistance of the task. High standards are to be built up, ideals maintained, habits rendered secure. The great problem for the teacher in this connection is so to organize both control and instruction that the largest possible opportunity is given to pupils for the exercise of their own powers of will in all school relations. 6. Freedom of the will, or the extent of its control. We have seen in this discussion that will is a mode of control of our thoughts and, through our thoughts, of our actions. Will may be looked upon, then, as the culmination of the mental life, the highest form of directive agent within us. Beginning with the direction of the simplest movements, it goes on until it governs the current of our life in the pursuit of some distant ideal. Limitations of the will. Just how far the will can go in its control Just how far man is a free moral agent has long been one of the mooted questions among the philosophers. But some few facts are clear. If the will can exercise full control over all our acts, it, by this very fact, determines our character, and character spells destiny. There is not the least doubt, however, that the will in thus directing us in the achievement of a destiny works under two limitations. First, every individual enters upon life with a large stock of inherited tendencies, which go far to shape his interests and aspirations. And these are important factors in the work of volition. Second, we all have our setting in the midst of a great material and social environment, which is largely beyond our power to modify, and whose influences are constantly playing upon us and molding us according to their type. These limitations, the conditions of freedom. Yet there is nothing in this thought to discourage us, for these very limitations have in them our hope of a larger freedom. Man's heredity, coming to him through ages of conflict with the forces of nature, with his brother man, and with himself, has deeply instilled in him the spirit of independence and self-control. It has trained him to deliberate, to choose, to achieve. It has developed in him the power to will. Likewise, man's environment, in which he must live and work, furnishes the problems which his life work is to solve, and out of whose solution will receives its only true development. It is through the action and interaction of these two factors, then, that man is to work out his destiny. What he is, coupled with what he may do, leads him to what he may become. Every man possesses in some degree a spark of divinity, a sovereign individuality, a power of independent initiative. This is all he needs to make him free, free to do his best in whatever walk of life he finds himself. If he will but do this, the doing of it will lead him into a constantly growing freedom, and he can voice the cry of every earnest heart. Build thee more stately mansions, O my soul, as the swift seasons roll. Leave thy low vaulted past, let each new temple, nobler than the last, shut thee from heaven with a dome more vast, till thou at length art free, leaving thine outgrown shell by life's unresting sea. 7. Problems in observation and introspection. 1. Give illustrations from your own experience of the various types of action mentioned in this discussion. From your own experience of the last hour, what examples of impulsive action can you give? Would it have been better in some cases had you stopped to deliberate? 2. Are you easily influenced by prejudice or personal preference in making decisions? What recent decisions have been thus affected? Can you classify the various ones of your decisions which you can recall under the 4 types mentioned in the text? Under which class does the largest number fall? Have you a tendency to drift with the crowd? Are you independent in deciding upon and following out a line of action? What is the value of advice? Ought advice to do more than to assist in getting all the evidence on a case before the one who is to decide? 3. Can you judge yourself well enough to tell to which volitional type you belong? Are you over-impulsive? Are you stubborn? What is the difference between stubbornness and firmness? Suppose you ask your instructor or a friend to assist you in classifying yourself as to volitional type. Are you troubled with indecision? That is, do you have hard work to decide in trivial matters even after you know all the facts in the case? What is the cause of these states of indecision? The remedy. 4. Have you a strong power of will? Can you control your attention? Do you submit easily to temptation? Can you hold yourself up to a high degree of effort? Can you persevere? Have you ever failed in the attainment of some cherished ideal because you could not bring yourself to pay the price in the sacrifice or effort necessary? 5. Consider the classwork and examinations of schools that you know. Does the system of management and control throw responsibility on the pupils in a way to develop their powers of will? 6. What motives or incentives can be used to encourage pupils to use self-compulsion to maintain high standards of excellence in their studies and conduct? Does it pay to be heroic in one's self-control? End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of The Mind and Its Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mind and Its Education by George Herbert BETTS. Chapter 18. Self-Expression and Development. We have already seen that the mind and the body are associated in a co-partnership in which each is an indispensable and active member. We have seen that the body gets its dignity and worth from its relation with the mind, and that the mind is dependent on the body for the crude material of its thought and also for the carrying out of its mandates in securing adaptation to our environment. We have seen as a corollary of these facts that the efficiency of both mind and body is conditioned by the manner in which each carries out its share of the mutual activities. Let's see something more of this interrelation. 1. Interrelation of impression and expression. No impression without corresponding expression has become a maxim in both physiology and psychology. Inner life implies self-expression in external activities. The stream of impressions pouring in upon us hourly from our environment must have means of expression if development is to follow. We cannot be passive recipients, but must be active participants in the educational process. We must not only be able to know and feel, but to do. The many sources of impressions. The nature of the impressions which come to us and how they all lead on towards ultimate expression is shown in the accompanying diagram. Our material environment is thrusting impressions upon us every moment of our life. Also, the material objects with which we deal have become so saturated with social values that each comes to us with a double significance, and what an object means often stands for more than what it is. From the lives of people with whom we daily mingle, from the wider circle whose lives do not immediately touch ours, but who are interpreted to us by the press, by history and literature, from the social institutions into which have gone the lives of millions and of which our lives form a part, there come to us constantly a flood of impressions whose influence cannot be measured. So likewise with the religious impressions, God is all about us and within us. He speaks to us from every nook and corner of nature and communes with us through the still small voice from within, if we will but listen. The Bible, religious institution, and the lives of good people are other sources of religious impressions constantly tending to mold our lives. The beautiful in nature, art, and human conduct constantly appeals to us in aesthetic impressions. All impressions lead towards expression. Each of these groups of impressions may be subdivided and extended into an almost indefinite number in variety, the different groups meeting and overlapping, it's true, yet each preserving reasonably distinct characteristics. A common characteristic of them all, as shown in the diagram, is that they all point towards expression. The varieties of light, color, form, and distance which we get through vision are not merely that we may know these phenomena of nature, but that, knowing them, we may use the knowledge in making proper responses to our environment. Our power to know human sympathy and love through our social impressions are not merely that we may feel these emotions, but that, feeling them, we may act in response to them. It is impossible to classify logically in any simple scheme all the possible forms of expression. The diagram will serve, however, to call attention to some of the chief modes of bodily expression and also to the results of the bodily expressions in the arts and vocations. Here again, the process of subdivision and extension can be carried out indefinitely. The laugh can be made to tell many different stories. Crying may express bitter sorrow or uncontrollable joy. Vocal speech may be carried on in 1,000 tongues. Dramatic action may be made to portray the whole range of human feelings. Plays and games are wide enough in their scope to satisfy the demands of all ages and every people. The handicrafts cover so wide a range that the material progress of civilization can be classed under them, and indeed, without their development, the arts and vocations would be impossible. Architecture, sculpture, painting, music, and literature have 1,000 possibilities, both in technique and content. Likewise, the modes of society, conduct, and religion are unlimited in their forms of expression. Limitations of expression. While it's more blessed to give than to receive, it's somewhat harder in the doing, for more of the self is, after all, involved in expression than in impression, expression needs to be cultivated as an art, for who can express all he thinks or feels or conceives? Who can do his innermost self-justice when he attempts to express it in language, in music, or in marble? The painter answers when praised for his work, "If you could but see the picture I intended to paint." The pupil says, "I know, but I cannot tell." The friend says, "I wish I could tell you how sorry I am." The actor complains, "If I could only portray the passion as I feel it, I could bring all the world to my feet." The body, being of grosser structure than the mind, must always lag somewhat behind in expressing the mind's states, yet so perfect is the harmony between the two, that with the body, well trained to respond to the mind's needs, comparatively little of the spiritual need be lost in its expression through the material. 2. The place of expression in development. Nor are we to think that cultivation of expression results in better power of expression alone, or that lack of cultivation results only in decreased power of expression. Intellectual value of expression. There is a distinct mental value in expression. An idea always assumes new clearness and wider relations when it's expressed. Michelangelo, making his plans for the great cathedral, found his first concept of the structure expanding and growing more beautiful as he developed his plans. The sculptor, beginning to model the statue after the image which he has in his mind, finds the image growing and becoming more expressive and beautiful as the clay is molded and formed. The writer finds the scope and worth of his book growing as he proceeds with the writing. The student, beginning doubtfully on his construction in geometry, finds the truth growing clearer as he proceeds. The child with a dim and hazy notion of the meaning of the story in history or literature discovers that the meaning grows clear as he himself works out its expression in speech, in the handicrafts, or in a dramatic representation. So we may apply the test to any realm of thought whatever, and the law holds good. It's not in its apprehension, but in its expression that the truth finally becomes assimilated to our body of usable knowledge. And this means that in all training of the body, through its motor expression, we are to remember that the mind must be behind the act, that the intellect must guide the hand, that the object is not to make skillful fingers alone, but to develop clear and intelligent thought as well. Moral value of expression. Expression also has a distinct moral value. There are many more people of good intentions than of moral character in the world. The rugged proverb tells us that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and how easy it's to form good resolutions. Who of us has not, after some moral struggle, said, "I will break the bonds of this habit, I will enter upon that heroic line of action," and then, satisfied for the time with having made the resolution, continued in the old path until we were surprised later to find that we had never got beyond the resolution? It's not in the moment of the resolve, but in the moment when the resolve is carried out in action, that the moral value inheres. To take a stand on a question of right and wrong means more than to show one's allegiance to the right. It clears one's own moral vision and gives him command of himself. Expression is, finally, the only true test for our morality. Lacking moral expression, we may stand in the class of those who are merely good, but we can never enter the class of those who are good for something. One cannot but wonder what would happen if all the people in the world who are morally right should give expression to their moral sentiments, not in words alone, but in deeds. Surely the millennium would speedily come, not only among the nations, but in the lives of men. Religious value of expression. True religious experience demands expression. The older conception of a religious life was to escape from the world and live a life of communion and contemplation in some secluded spot, ignoring the world, thirsting without. Later religious teaching, however, recognized the fact that religion cannot consist in drinking in blessings alone, no matter how ecstatic the feeling which may accompany the process. That it's not the receiving, but this, along with the giving, that enriches the life. To give the cup of cold water, to visit the widow and the fatherless, to comfort and help the needy and forlorn, this is not only scriptural, but it's psychological. Only as a religious feeling goes out into religious expression can we have a normal religious experience. Social value of expression. The criterion of an education once was, how much does he know? The world did not expect an educated man to do anything. He was to be put on a pedestal and admired from a distance. But this criterion is now obsolete. Society cares little how much we know if it does not enable us to do. People no longer admire mere knowledge, but insist that the man of education shall put his shoulder to the wheel and lend a hand wherever help is needed. Education is no longer to set men apart from their fellows, but to make them more efficient comrades and helpers in the world's work. Not the man who knows chemistry and botany, but he who can use this knowledge to make 2 blades of grass grow where but one grew before, is the true benefactor of his race. In short, the world demands services returned for opportunities afforded. It expects social expression to result from education. And this is also best for the individual, for only through social service can we attain to a full realization of the social values in our environment. Only thus can we enter fully into the social heritage of the ages, which we receive from books and institutions. Only thus can we come into the truest and best relations with humanity in a common brotherhood. Only thus can we live the broader and more significant life and come to realize the largest possible social self. 3. Educational use of expression. The educational significance of the truth illustrated in the diagram and the discussion has been somewhat slow in taking hold in our schools. This has been due not alone to the slowness of the educational world to grasp a new idea, but also to the practical difficulties connected with adapting the school exercises as well to the expression side of education as to the impression. From the fall of Athens on down to the time of Herbert, the schools were constituted on the theory that pupils were to receive education, that they were to drink in knowledge, that their minds were to be stored with facts. Children were to be seen and not heard. Education was largely a process of gorging the memory with information. Easier to provide for the impression side of education. Now it's evident that it's far easier to provide for the passive side of education than for the active side. All that is needed in the former case is to have teachers and books reasonably full of information and pupils sufficiently docile to receive it. But in the latter case, the equipment must be more extensive. If the child is to be allowed to carry out his impressions into action, if he is actually to do something himself, then he must be supplied with adequate equipment. So far as the home life was concerned, the child of several generations ago was at a decided advantage over the child of today on the expression side of his education. The homes of that day were beehives of industry, in which a dozen handicrafts were taught and practiced. The buildings, the farm implements, and the most of the furniture of the home were made from the native timber. The material for the clothing of the family was produced on the farm, made into clothes, and finally into garments in the home. Nearly all the supplies for the table came likewise from the farm. These industries demanded the combined efforts of the family, and each child did his or her part. But that day is past. One half of our people live in cities and towns, and even in the village and on the farm, the handicrafts of the home have been relegated to the factory, and everything comes into the home ready for use. The telephone, the mail carrier, and the delivery man do all the errands even, and the child in the home is deprived of responsibility and of nearly all opportunity for manual expression. This is no one's fault, for it's just one phase of a great industrial readjustment in society. Yet the fact remains that the home has lost an important element in education, which the school must supply if we are not to be the losers educationally by the change. The school to take up the handicrafts. And modern educational method is insisting precisely on this point. A few years ago, the boy caught whittling in school was a fit subject for a flogging. The boy is today given bench and tools and is instructed in their use. Then the child was punished for drawing pictures. Now we are using drawing as one of the best modes of expression. Then instruction in singing was entrusted to an occasional evening class, which only the older children could attend, and which was taught by some itinerant singing master. Today, we make music one of our most valuable school exercises. Then, all playtime was so much time wasted. Now we recognize play as a necessary and valuable mode of expression and development. Then, dramatic representation was confined to the occasional exhibition or evening entertainment. Now it has become a recognized part of our school work. Then it was a crime for pupils to communicate with each other in school. Now a part of the school work is planned so that pupils work in groups and thus receive social training. Then Our schoolrooms were destitute of every vestige of beauty. Today, many of them are artistic and beautiful. This statement of the case is rather over-optimistic if applied to our whole school system, however, for there are still many schools in which all forms of handicraft are unknown and in which the only training in artistic expression is that which comes from caricaturing the teacher. Singing is still an unknown art to many teachers. The play instinct is yet looked upon with suspicion and distrust in some quarters. A large number of our schoolrooms are as barren and ugly today as ever, and contain an atmosphere as stifling to all forms of natural expression. We can only comfort ourselves with Holmes's maxim that it matters not so much where we stand as in what direction we are moving. And we certainly are moving toward a larger development and a greater efficiency in expression on the part of those who pass through our schools. Expression and character. Finally, all that has been said in this discussion has direct reference to what we call character, that mysterious something which we so often hear eulogized and so seldom analyzed. Character has two distinct phases, which may be called the subjective phase and the social phase, or stating it differently, character is both what we are and what we do. The first of these has to do with the nature of the real innermost self, and the last with the modes in which this self finds expression. And it's fair to say that those about us are concerned with what we are chiefly from its relation to what we do. Character is not a thing, but a process. It is the succession of our thoughts and acts from hour to hour. It's not something which we can hoard and protect and polish into a more perfect day, but it's the everyday self in a process of living. And the only way in which it can be made or marred is through the nature of this stream of thoughts and acts which constitute the day's life, is through being or doing, well or ill. Two lines of development. The cultivation of character must, then, ignore neither of these two lines. To neglect the first is to forget that it's out of the abundance of the heart that the mouth speaks, that a corrupt tree cannot bring forth good fruit, that the act is the true index of the soul. To omit the second is to leave the character half-formed, the will weak, and the life inefficient and barren of results. The mind must be supplied with noble ideas and high ideals, with right emotions and worthy ambitions. On the other hand, the proper connection must be established between these mental states and appropriate acts. And the acts must finally grow into habits, so that we naturally and inevitably translate our ideas and ideals, our emotions and ambitions into deeds. Our character must be strong, not in thought and feeling alone, but also in the power to return to the world its finished product in the form of service. 4. Problems in introspection and observation. 1. Do you find that you understand better some difficult point or problem after you have succeeded in stating it? Do you remember better what you have expressed? 2. In which particular ones of your studies do you think you could have done better if you had been given more opportunity for expression? Explain the psychology of the maxim, we learn to do by doing. 3. Observe various schools at work for the purpose of determining whether opportunities for expression in the recitations are adequate. Have you ever seen a class, when listless from listening, liven up when they were given something to do themselves? 4. Make a study of the types of laughter you hear. Why is some laughter much more pleasant than other laughter? What did a noted sculptor mean when he said that a smile at the eyes cannot be depended upon as can one at the mouth? 5. What examples have you observed in children's plays showing their love for dramatic representation? What handicrafts are the most suitable for children of primary grades? For the grammar school? For the high school? 6. Do you number those among your acquaintance who seem bright enough so far as learning is concerned, but who cannot get anything accomplished? Is the trouble on the expression side of their character? What are you doing about your own powers of expression? Are you seeking to cultivate expression in new lines? Is there danger in attempting too many lines? End of 18. End of The Mind and Its Education by George Herbert BETTS.